drawn experience within the classroom as well. And
a Tutor reading aloud program that I set up in a school a few years ago. So I'll just give you, hang on, it's not moving on. Oh, there we are. A bit of information about myself. So I'm an English teacher, as Jake said, primarily. I've taught a bit of history and I teach media, but essentially an English teacher. I've been teaching for about 21 years now, unfortunately. I used to be a head of English in Bridlington, and after my second son, I stepped down from that and became a main-scale part-time teacher, and over the years took on a number of different kind of additional roles, and one of them was a whole school literacy lead when I worked in Beverley at the time, and that's where I set up the programme that I'm going to talk about. And then, as Jake said, currently I'm a trust leader for curriculum and research. With a group of us do that, and also we work within the Wold Associate Research School, and I'm the research lead for literacy within that sits within our trust. So that's kind of the background to it. So as an English teacher and just as a person who likes to read, I have always been interested in reading, and in the idea that, just as this quotation says from Margaret Atwood, it's about communication with lots of people, it's about making your way through society, and it really does open doors. It is power, it's knowledge. So I think that although literacy is a huge area, and there's lots and lots of things we could look at there, there's lots more we can do than what this reading programme would ever do. But this kind of idea sits at the heart of it, I think, in terms of what I intended to try to achieve with it, or to begin to achieve with it once it got underway. So, some background to it. So, this study from the Literacy Trust is probably quite not even a shock to people these days. We see that teenagers and children are not reading as much as they were probably when we were younger. Partly, I think that is the digital age and the way that their lives have changed, society is changing. But a shocking statistic, really, that we're trying to get pupils to access a more challenging curriculum, but they're not necessarily reading for themselves, they're not reading at home. And so all the experiences and the knowledge and the emotional literacy that you get from reading, these children are not necessarily experiencing. This slide I added today, actually, it was shared on Twitter this morning from Fiona, who is Always Learn. I can't see the actual thing underneath the pictures. I think it's Always Learn Web, is it? Something like that. But Fiona Ritson, thank you, Jake. And she also runs a reading programme similar to this, and has written blogs on it, so it's worth looking at hers. But she'd done recently this survey of all her pupils, so she's a head of English, and into their reading for pleasure habits. And the thing that we thought was quite interesting was this bottom pie chart, that if we look at why this year 7 class didn't read, and the majority of them are saying it's because they are playing games or watching Netflix, and these are the things that are drawing their attention. And I know from my own children that the Xbox is the biggest lure in their lives, and it's a challenge to come up against that all the time. But I don't think it's something that should be a challenge for the English department. Literacy is a whole school issue. This book I came across via Doug Lamoff, actually. It's a really interesting book that looks at the effect of constantly living in a digital world on the reading brain. So I'm just going to be quiet for a minute, and if people would like to read the little extract. And probably we can all relate to that. We're all sat on digital social media and so forth now, and obviously it has its benefits. Obviously it's changed our lives in many ways for the better, but it is something that is a constant draw on our attention, and it's something that changes the way that we engage with words and the way that we the depth of our reading. And Doug Lamoff wrote about this book and wrote a review of it, and this quotation here, "We are a nation of addicts, raising a nation of addicts," is really at the core of it. Everything we read now tends to be, we read on Twitter, we link from Twitter to maybe a news article, we scan it, we don't read slowly and for depth. And that, because we do it a lot of times, he argues, the book argues, that it's almost over time a kind of rewiring of our brain, so that we don't read and pay attention in the same way, we don't make notes in the same way. And so this is something that the less we read on paper and the more short snippets, sound bites of reading we do, the bigger impact it's going to have on our ability to read closely and pull out meaning. And then some of the other facts and sort of evidence base that went around it. This one I think is really important. So for our mental health, reading has been proven to have a big impact in a positive way. So in this study, it looked at feelings of loneliness and found that they were significantly reduced in people who read books all the time. There's a kind of meditative effect to it. And it's the idea that it's kind of, you engage with other lives and other people if you read books, especially fiction, or not necessarily always fiction. And I think especially in the times that we're going through now, thinking about how we can support children when they come back, how we can give them an experience that in somehow is going to give them, even if they don't realise it, a kind of comfort and improve that for them. And that's really important. Another piece of evidence behind it, that people have probably seen this before, but people who read regularly and well and fluently is one of the strongest indicators of future earnings. And it can seem that that is kind of a crass way to look at it. And obviously we're here to educate them for many more reasons than that. We're here to broaden their horizons, help them to make progress. But ultimately, as well as sending them out there as rounded citizens, we are there to make them employable. We are there to help them in their future. And actually, particularly if pupils are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, then if they can read, it opens up possibilities for them, which they might not have otherwise. Also, there's a lot of work being done on vocabulary at the moment and over the last few years. And we are all becoming more and more aware of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary. But when we develop our vocabulary, we actually develop the majority of it through reading, but we're not exposed to reading. So we get our language through our tier 1 language through conversation, and we develop that on a daily basis. 83% of our language comes from that, but that tends to be tier 1 vocabulary. So the tier 2 vocabulary and tier 3, the language of academia, you get that through reading. And if you're not reading, then you are at a disadvantage. And then also, it's not about English, it's about all subjects. Alex Quigley at Research Ed last year came out with this statement that vocabulary is the fabric of our curriculum. And I think that's a really, really nice way to look at it. Vocabulary is knowledge. And at the heart of all our subjects, that's what we're there to teach pupils. And we read to learn at every stage. We want pupils to be successful at GCSE, at A level, at degree level, and they need to read well to be able to do that. And as we said in the last slide, the majority of that academic vocabulary we are going to get from reading and not through spoken language. So, reading for pleasure is a well-used phrase, and it's important, and I think we should encourage our pupils to read for pleasure. And certainly throughout all the schools I've worked in, there's always been a push for that. Things like World Book Day, there are competitions, and these things are worthwhile, but arguably have very little impact. And reading for pleasure and dressing up as a character on World Book Day is not going to help you to be able to read for pleasure, to form those reading habits that you need to get into. So in schools, these kind of things have been around for a long time. When I was head of English, I was a big advocate of silent reading. We used to do 10 minutes of silent reading at the start of every lesson. At one point when I was in Bridlington, we had form time reading, silent reading, and pushed for that because we thought that was the best thing for the kids to be doing. That developed over the years I never worked in a school that did it, but to things like drop everything and read, where the whole school would do that. And that tries to give it a whole school priority, but still it's silent reading. Still it's about individuals sitting there to read a book on their own. And although the teacher might be reading at the same time their own book, the pupils are still individually doing that. And there's issues around that. So if you are a struggling reader and you find reading difficult, sitting there for 20 minutes and reading a book is not a pleasure. It's actually something that is frustrating, demoralizing, can actually lower self-esteem in many ways. If you're sat there and you can't access it, you can't enjoy it, you're sat there perhaps not able to read books that you can see people around you reading much more challenging books. And actually it can turn into, as I said, lowering self-esteem and sometimes create conflict between the teacher and the pupil. So I wanted to look at a way that would encourage children, would have children reading, but which wasn't asking them to do it on their own. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for that, and we should encourage reading and encourage pupils to read in class, but this was looking at a different way that we could set up that form time. Also, we considered, and I'll talk a little bit more about Accelerated Reader in a little bit, programs like Accelerated Reader can be really successful. I know that in some schools they work really well, but that again is still reliant on pupils reading individually. It requires a massive investment in time, in training, in money, and it was something that I just thought wasn't what was required at the time in the context that I was working. Programs like Thinking Reading, and there's different versions of this, I think can be really effective and are something that I would look into and have been looking into. But again, that's an individual intervention. So it's not something that's going to work on a whole school basis. So what I kind of decided to do, and this was in 2016, around the end of 2016, was to reframe the issue. So I started to think about, instead of reading for pleasure, could it be reading for benefit? So I thought about the kind of things that we would want pupils to know. And in English, at the school I was working in, the new GCSEs, we taught for the two pre-19th century books, either Pride and Prejudice or Great Expectations, which are challenging books and long books, not taught very often actually. I'm a senior examiner on that literature text, and the books that are taught the most tend to be the shorter ones because they are challenging. But we wanted to have high expectations for our pupils, and they all did it really well. But we were doing that in English, and they didn't have, apart from within the curriculum that we'd put in place below it, they didn't have a lot of experience of different types of literature. So the challenge was even more difficult because of that. And then also, even beyond that, we want to give our pupils experiences and frames of references that can support them in later life. So if we think about going to university, for example, we should have that ambition for all of our pupils, whether or not they want to. If we have the ambition, it's more likely that's going to happen. But I remember I went to university. I was the first person in my family to go to university. But I'd always been an avid reader. I read books at home. My mum had always read books. I'd read Jane Eyre, and I'd read all of Austen. I thought that I was well read. But when I got to university, I discovered that actually I knew barely anything. There was so much out there that I hadn't read, that authors I'd never heard of. And so automatically you feel excluded from the conversations around you. And you don't have that kind of pass into that little secret world that people might have from different walks of life. So I think that if we can give them an experience of texts that just give them a frame of reference, then we're supporting them in those conversations to take part in different parts of society. And at the end of the day, my favourite bit is, if you can have the winning answer in the local pub quiz, you can win a keg of beer. And if that's all it's achieved for you, then you've done something. So I started to think about, how can we help pupils to read for benefit? And this idea, I think, sits at the centre of it all. Doug Lamothe is my kind of reading hero, and the book Reading Reconsidered, I think, was a seminal text for me. And I would recommend anybody who's interested in reading at all, whether that's through just any subject or something like this, to read that book. And sitting at the heart of it, this idea that expert modelling, as we do in other aspects of the curriculum, is essential in reading. And in that book, he talks about that pupils as old as 15 and 16 still benefit from the modelling of more challenging texts by somebody who is a better reader than they are. So listening to the syntax, listening to the varied sentences, hearing kind of the flow of the reading is something that enables them to kind of absorb it and to become familiar with that, so that it's not such a challenge for them each time they come to a more challenging text. And that modelling, we hope that they get that from a young age. We hope that children get it from their parents, that children are read to when they're young. And for many children that is the case, but for some it never happens. But even for the ones that do, and I know from my own children, I read to them when they were in primary school, but once they can read and they read well, you stop, you step back, and we don't read to them anymore. And we expect them to carry on by themselves, but we take that expert away from them right at the beginning of their reading career. So really the teacher needs to be the expert that models that reading for them all the way through their school career. And then this piece of evidence, this study came out actually in 2018 after I set this up. I set this up and launched it in the school in 2017 in September. But I think this is really important because it supports what this programme does, and also is just a really, really interesting piece of evidence. So it was a study in the south of England with 20 English teachers taking part. So not a big study, and we always have to be cautious when looking at evidence. We have to take it for what it is, read around, etc. But in this study, the English teachers worked with pupils of age 12 to 13 who were all weak readers or average to weak readers. And 10 of the English teachers were given specific training in reading comprehension so that they could support pupils whilst they were reading in different ways. And then what they did was, in a way that wouldn't normally happen in most English classrooms, was that they took 2 whole novels, not extracts, and they read them back to back in 12 weeks. So they read them at a much faster pace than normal. So normally we would read a novel, we would stop after maybe some paragraphs, we would stop after a chapter, we would look at characters, look at plot development, etc., etc. And we're constantly stopping and starting, thinking that we are supporting pupils because we're going slowly for them, we're checking their understanding all the time. But we're giving them all this information and they're not getting a chance to get to grips with the story. So we're kind of like actually giving them a cognitive overload, arguably, just by stopping and starting. So in this project, all of the teachers with all of their classes read 2 novels, the same 2 novels in 12 weeks at a faster pace, back to back. And when they had done this, they retested the pupils. And students in both the groups, the ones with the teachers who've not had any training and the teachers who had, all made a mean progress of 8.5 months in the reading standardisation scores, which for any pupil is a massive rate of progress. However, for the weaker readers, the progress was much more significant. They made 16 months progress in 12 weeks. And that was assessed on the reading comprehension standardised tests. But the interesting thing about this was that the comprehension training that the teachers had made absolutely no difference to those results. So the results were the same across all of the classes. So the implication is that it was the reading, the fast reading, the continuation of the story, we learn through stories, that had the impact. And this piece of research has been obviously really well received. And within English classrooms, there's many teachers now looking at what we call fast reads, where we take a novel and read it and then study it later. But it's a different way of doing things. But within the reading programme that I set up, essentially this is what you're doing: reading a novel quickly, just for the sake of reading it. So back in 2016, in the school that I was in then, so I was whole school literacy lead then, and research lead at the time, and I was thinking about the problems that we had in the school. So the first one was that in that school we'd had accelerated reader. You have a 3-year license with accelerated reader. It had been bought into the school, but never ever been set up properly. It had been passed between SLT. No one had ever set it up. The librarian had originally labelled all the books, a mammoth task. Some TAs were using it, but it had never been used with pupils, a complete waste of money. One of the issues there was that within the middle of that, they closed the library down, a travesty, and got rid of the librarian, and all we had left were a wall of books that had been salvaged by the English department and the TAs. So running something like Accelerated Reader was going to be increasingly difficult. I was given the task in the final year of its license of setting it up as literacy coordinator. And I decided to run a trial with 20 pupils in year 7, retrain the TAs with the proper training for it, and some teachers, and ran that trial. And although progress could be made, when I priced it up, it was going to cost us, I think it was around £8,000 to £9,000 for another 3-year license. And we would only have enough licenses for 1 year group, around 150 pupils, plus a few extra for TA use. So I just began to think that it wasn't worth spending the money. We did have within the school a silent reading form time. I think it might have even been, I think it was just 1 a week. But within the school, it wasn't pushed, it wasn't enforced. I wasn't a form tutor. And so kind of wasn't really aware of that at first. But I took over a form in year 9 when someone was on long-term absence and realised that these pupils had not been reading, that teachers were not doing it across the school. It wasn't enforced by SLT. And so it was a challenge right from the start. So when pupils were being told to read by the form tutors, often they wouldn't have a book with them. They would be sent to the library to grab one, the wall of books in our library. The TAs would just let them out with the book and sign it back in on paper. But over the course of a year, we'd lost 140 books from the library that had just been taken away and not brought back. So there were no consistent routines in place. And this was quite a high achieving school. So we wanted an academic atmosphere, but there was a lack of reading culture within the school. It wasn't prioritised and it wasn't given a significance within the school. And at the time as well, we were coming up to the new job, or perhaps starting the new GCSEs. There was that challenging curriculum across all subjects, a need for knowledge and cultural capital, which we cannot give through just curriculum alone. So I was looking for a way that we could help to support all subjects by building knowledge within that. So I came up with this idea of whole school tutor reading. I didn't come up with it from scratch. I had been to visit Michaela School to the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Teachers Conference. I had heard Katie Ashford talk about reading. They had teachers reading aloud to pupils, and I think had written some blog posts on it. And I just thought it was a really, really interesting idea. So we would have reading in tutor time, but the pupils would not do the reading. They would read, but the tutor would read aloud to them, and always the teacher. And the idea that we had, and I'll explain how we did it later, was that the pupils would have copies of the text and they would read along, but it would always be the teacher that read. This can be a contentious debate. So when we process and comprehend language, we do it through this phonological loop. So we see words, we see a visual representation, which are the words on the page, and we hear through our auditory channels the sound of the word, and these things working together help us to comprehend. And there is an argument, and this picture here is from David Didow, who is the learning spy, and I've spoken to him about it before, and he argues that we shouldn't have the pupils read along, because there is an argument that if we are reading, and especially for weaker readers, if they are reading along and they have to process the image at the same time as the sound, that is cognitive overload, and they struggle with that. However, there are differing opinions. I'd spoken to someone else within the Research School Network who'd said that if you were reading something from a PowerPoint, for example, that is different words, you struggle to do the two things together. So we shouldn't speak while someone's reading from a PowerPoint. But if they are reading the same words as we are saying it, that the challenge isn't quite so high. But this is in debate. So some people might say it's better for the teacher to read and the pupils just listen, but there are still people that prefer the pupils to read along. And in our school, we decided that we wanted the pupils to read the books for a number of different reasons. And I know that does still happen in other reading projects that are running at the same time. So I needed to find a way to support teachers and to make this work. So the EASE framework is something that was created by the Behavioural Insights team, and they looked at a government department, and they looked at when you are planning for a project, the problems, and how can we make it easy for the participants or the people involved, attractive, social and timely. So what are the ingredients that we can do? Plan for that. They call it in Huntington Research School, do a pre-mortem. So plan for what's going to go wrong at the beginning. And if we do that, we've got more chance of it succeeding in the end. So this went back to why we decided that we would have the pupils read copies of the text. Firstly, because we wanted them to be able to see the syntax, be able to see the vocabulary, and to hear what they were seeing on the page. But secondly, because at the beginning, in order to support the behavioural side of it, to make it easier for tutors to know that the pupils were paying attention, if the pupils are sat there and they have the book and they have to be looking their eyes down on the page, it's easier to see if they're listening at all, if they're concentrating and they're not just looking out the window, turning around and not focusing. So as part of our routines and consistency, we decided that in our school at the time that didn't have that in place, it was going to be beneficial for tutors. Another thing along that line was that I gave them bookmarks, which were just basically bits of cardboard chopped into bookmarks. And we used them at the end of the session. You would all put it into the book, put the books back in the box, and then the next session, you get them out, they're at the right place straight away. And also those bookmarks can be used as line guides. So if you train the pupils to read with the line guide in the book as they go, if you stop to explain a word to them or to make sure they've understood something, then when you've finished, you can quickly get back to the page. Instead of like, does everyone know where we are? Find the word, where are we on that page? It's quicker. And it's really useful in lesson time as well. But certainly when you're working in a form time and there isn't as much time available. Another thing that I did was think about the routine that we wanted each form time to take. The rules or the kind of guidelines for tutors, but for the pupils, and created these posters which were put around all of the form rooms, which the pupils were given a kind of training in, I suppose, and so that it was clear what was expected of pupils and students. So if we went round, we should be able to see the same thing in every classroom happening. And then alongside that as well, to kind of create some parental support, really, things like the school newsletter. I did an article in there explaining why we were doing this, the reasoning behind it, why it was different to reading for pleasure. On open evenings, I would have a kind of display illustrating the books and again some of the evidence behind it, so that there was really this kind of a buy-in, hopefully, from all parties as to why we were doing this. And then the next thing to make it easy for people as well was to make sure that it was planned out and that it was a really rigid structure. So within that school where I set it up, we used to have assembly every week. We had a kind of quiz. We had a literacy discussion article in place and something else originally. I managed to get from SLT 2 form times a week. So I managed to take over 2. Ideally, you would want 3 or more. And our tutor times were only 15 minutes. So I know some people have much longer than that, and that would lend itself better, probably. In 15 minutes, you have to be really quick. The routines have to be really slick. There has to be a child getting the books out, even before the tutor's there. The book's handed out, the form captain hands them out or something, and then straight back in at the end, so that you get the 15 minutes. But we had 2 of these a week per form group, and we had to have a rigid timetable. I tried to stagger it across the year groups so they were all reading on as much on different days as possible, so that then myself and some other people who didn't have tutor groups could go into the forms to support the tutors, to model the reading. So for tutors who were unsure, we would go in and do it for them for a while, and you could go around and check it was happening. And if people were swapping days and not doing it on the right day, you couldn't do that, so you couldn't support them. So it was really important that we had a timetable and that tutors stuck to it. And then that was 2016, the planning. So in September of 2017, we launched it. It took a lot of sorting books over the summer holidays. A lot of my son at the time, I don't know what he must have been, about 10 or 11, had to come in as child labour and stamp hundreds and hundreds of books. And it took a lot of prep to set up, but we needed it to be right and ready. And then we launched it in September to staff on the training days. So I did a full training session for all of the tutors, and then later ones for all of the teachers in the school, because I realised that actually, even though the tutors were doing it, we had to have the entire school buying into this. We had to have support from every teacher, and that was really important. And then also I created some PowerPoints, just really short ones, that would give a little bit of pre-reading information, maybe about the genre or the themes or the author. Perhaps it would only be for one tutor group session that you'd use that for. And then some post-reading information if the tutors wanted to use it. So they weren't studying the books at all. They weren't stopping along the way, and the kids didn't have to fill anything in. They didn't have to write anything down. It was just reading for the sake of reading. But then sort of reading group questions at the end, which tutors could use to prompt a discussion with their group before they moved on to another book, to discuss the issues in the text. And then this is probably one of the most key ingredients to the whole thing. I decided that we needed to have guest readers. So myself and the head of English and a couple of others had gone in at the start to model reading to tutors that were particularly worried about it. But then, in order to give it status, in order to give it importance to the pupils and to all the staff, and to provide extra modelling, I decided that we should invite SLT and some other people to come in and be guest readers. So the head teacher included, all of SLT came in. Initially, it was for at least twice a half term. So they would do 2 sessions every half term. The head teacher actually chose to do more. And for the first term, took year 7 and did every form group week after week. So she had met them all and worked her way up the school. When I initially set it up as well, I looked at the forms where there was less established routine. They were perhaps a more challenging form group anyway, or the teacher was less confident. And I used SLT first, the ones in particular that were really, really strong on behaviour, to go into those forms to support there first, which was to support the tutor, but to support me and all of us in making sure that it worked. And then actually creating the SLT rota, which I published every term for them, and for the person who arranged cover actually also had the rota, so that it was never missed. If someone was off, somebody knew that reading was taking place. That was the biggest job, the SLT rota, but it was really, really worthwhile, because I think that sometimes these things fail because somebody is given the job to do it, or somebody comes up with an idea and it's seen as the English department's responsibility, or it's just that person making us do something. But if we want it to succeed, we have to give it status in the school, and it has to become part of our culture to create a reading culture. So it's something that has to be led by the top and modelled from the top so that everybody buys into it. And as teachers, then we realise it's our responsibility to support this, because we understand why, hopefully from the training and the CPD, that it's important to the pupils and that it's part of the culture. So the basic process that I undertook was initially took the idea to the acting head teacher at the time and put forward a proposal of how much accelerated reader had cost, but how much this could potentially cost us. So I created a proposal with the costings in place so that when I went to him, it wasn't just a half-cooked idea, it was something tangible. Eventually, I think I did get given a budget of a few £1,000s to buy some new text, but it was a significantly smaller amount than the accelerated reader was going to cost us. And the first thing I did then was go into the English stock cupboards and find all the books that were gathering dust that had been sitting there since we'd, over the last few years, been overhauling our curriculum anyway. And we'd increased the challenge within our curriculum. So there was piles and piles of set class sets of books that were not being used. So I went through this with a colleague who helped me and decided which one of these would be useful, which would be relevant. And at the heart of this, I wanted the books to be challenging. I wanted them to be the books that pupils would not pick up themselves, would probably not have read. So that was the first thing. And when we'd done that, I kind of consulted with other teachers, not just the English department, asked other colleagues what books they thought they would like to see included, what they thought would be appropriate challenging texts. And from that, I purchased class sets of books so that we had enough we had 5 forms in a year group, and we had to have at least 7 or 8 sets of books. Some schools could do it or do it with maybe the whole year group reading the same text, and you could do that, and there's lots and lots of benefits to that, but arguably it's much more expensive unless you use the classic texts that you can get, the like cheaper editions of, the £2 or £3. But because we were using what we had in the English stock cupboard first, it wasn't really viable for us. So I needed to have enough boxes of books so that if one form finished a book and others hadn't, they could put that back, get another box, and could keep going around on rotation. So I organised the books into year group initially. After the first year, I decided to move it into sort of pairs. So I had 7 and 8 together, and then 8 and 9 together, so that there was more choice of books to move around within that. As I said earlier, created the clear guidelines, etc., and timetable. Oh, I don't know what I've done there. September CPD, launched it in September in 2017, initially just with Key Stage 3, but a year 10 tutor who was having trouble with the silent reading, and particularly one girl in the year 10 class who said that she'd never been read to in her life, and she was a child from quite a privileged background, really, had professional parents, but had never been read to, and was really rebelling against the idea of sitting there reading. And I think that's important, that we don't assume that it's just pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds that don't read or that are not read to at home, because it can come from any walk of life. So we decided to launch it into year 10 as well from Christmas. And we left year 11 as a study session. And then we modelled the reading for less confident tutors and had the guest readers, as said, and eventually built up an ambition that all pupils were engulfed in a culture of reading and cultural capital. So some of the books, these are not all of them, but these are some of the books that we used, and you can see that there is a kind of range in the year 7 and 8, a mix between some kind of young adult kind of fiction, or young teenage fiction, sorry, and some of them, like private school, eventually might go. So primary schools do sometimes teach that. So we don't teach it in English anymore, and haven't done for a number of years, but as a reading text. And whilst we were initially building up the collection, those kind of texts were really useful to use. But we tried to sort of interdisperse it with some more challenging texts such as Treasure Island. And then in year 9 and 10, it became much more the challenging texts and more classic texts that we put into that. There was pushback from, I'm sorry, I'm rushing because I feel like I've run over. There was pushback from some teachers, some tutors. Some teachers are terrified to read to their pupils. They just don't do it, which shouldn't be the case, but it is. Some said that they don't read even to their own children. And people are frightened of doing things that is out of their comfort zone. But I would argue that we are all degree educated professional people and we should be able to read. And we are not asking the teachers to teach literature. One said, oh, we're teaching English now. You're not. All you're doing is reading a book to a child, kind of in loco parentis, really. So we're not asking them to write essays, we're not asking them to teach any of it, just read it. And pupils, occasionally there was pushback from some pupils, usually the louder ones that would actually like to challenge, like to argue back. But arguably they need it just as much. It's not going to do them any harm to read the book. They need it just as much as anybody. And those are the pupils really that I was concerned with. I think that the feedback we got about how useful it was in terms of calm routines, a kind of meditative start to the day, and those quiet pupils who like to read, who don't get heard, who don't voice their opinions, they're the ones to give them that nice kind of relaxed, calm start that I think we should be putting our efforts into. So these are just a selection of some of them. So after 2 years, it's now in its 3rd year, but I've moved to another school. After 2 years, this is one form in year 8. So in year 7 and year 8, this form had read these books. We can see there's a selection there. Roll of Thunder in particular is quite challenging for year 8. Later, as a form book, I later moved it into year 9, and it was quite long for them to get through. So one of the things that I learned after that was to try and maybe look for shorter texts, because if you're only reading twice a week, it takes quite a long time to get through them. If you have more form tutor time available, then that wouldn't be such an issue. This was a year 10 form. So in year 9 and then in year 10, they had read this selection of books, which again is really kind of eclectic. So if we look at Kafka, for example, often people wouldn't even read that before university. Very short, but very abstract, very weird. But the themes and kind of ideas in it are the kind of thing that, you know, being a bit of a misfit, not fitting in, that pupils can engage with. So if we read it to them and make them excited about it, then we're exposing them to things that I don't think I'd even heard of Kafka until I got to university. And then this is just another year 10 form. Again, much more classic texts, some of them like Capturing the Rye, a bit of a rite of passage perhaps. And a big selection of books. So by the time they'd only read for 2 years. The pupils that have been doing it from year 7, by the time they get to year 10, are going to have read a significant selection of texts that they probably would not ever pick up before if they were not really engaged in reading. So going forward, the kind of things to think about now might be increasing the diversity perhaps in the text, starting to look at, once we've got the initial, we've made use of the resources we had, do we need to increase diversity, the range of text within it? As pupils get used to doing it, and as we are reading challenging text with them over time, do we need to then increase the challenge? Because they hopefully have made progress. So do we need to look at increasing it or bringing the challenge further down the school as we go on? Looking at other ways the school can support the whole programme. So perhaps assemblies could be linked by theme to the books that are being read. If the whole school is reading the same, or the whole year group, even better. But if not, there will be common themes coming through the books, which might link to current affairs. So that group that we're reading Roll of Thunder, with all the things that have been going on recently around Black Lives Matter and so forth, there are links that can be made so we can bring the books into a current context. And one other thing, I've moved now, I'm at a new school where I was in the process of talking about establishing this kind of thing within the trust. Then we had lockdown. And one thing we've been thinking about now is, even in the new form of school we go back to, where maybe we don't have tutor time in the same way, if we've got it, this kind of intervention for all children to benefit from, and the kind of mental health benefits it has, might be something that could be done quite easily in those form times if they're available. And if we do as David Ditto suggests, just the tutor has a book, then we're not passing things around, we're not spreading that, it's cheaper, and it's the way forward. Anyway, I rushed that because I rambled on, I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Jo, thank you. I love that. Certainly from a non-specialist point of view, it was great. I've written loads, by the way. I've got those pictures and stuff. So cheers for that. We've got some questions. Do you want me to make myself host now, just in case?
Yeah, do that, and then
that alleviates some pressure. So
does that just stop sharing? There you go.
Don't do anything just yet, Jo. I need to. I need to click on you. You'd think I'd know by now how to use. It's not working. Why is it not working?
Do I need to make you the host? Hang on.
It's all right, I can.
Oh no, I don't think I can do it.
Because I've called myself Lou, you see, it's very confusing. I was going.
No, I forgot.
Which Lou are you? Oh, this.
Right, reclaim host. It's all very strange. It's like Alien, isn't it? I am now.
That's really confused me, because it's just come up on my screen and said Lou is now the host. Right.
So, Jo, you can now leave, but don't leave. Don't go anywhere. There's lots of questions. I've got questions, but I think it's better if we go to the attendees first. So, if we go to so Helena's first question. So this is to do with accelerated reader. What? Oh no, everyone's commenting now. Hang on, don't scrap. What do you recommend for baseline testing for reading age rather than accelerated reader?
Well, in that school that I worked in before, and in the trust that I work in now, we use the new group reading tests. So you have to buy them in, and they are relatively expensive, but they test reading comprehension, there's spelling tests and things as well. And we used to test them in that school. We used to test them at the start of year 7 and the middle of year 8 and then the end of year 9. So we were tracking their reading age throughout the key stage. I didn't, in terms of the reading programme, didn't assess that quantitatively in that way, because it's a huge, so many things are happening in school. I couldn't narrow it down to that having a particular impact. But in terms of qualitative feedback and the benefits that I talked around, improving confidence, exposing them to a different range of text, for that we use things like pupil voice, staff survey and things like that. But in terms of actual reading age, I've always used a new group reading test.
You know, you lose as well. I just love the idea of just nice, calm, silent start to the day. We're going to do some reading. Mm-hmm. What a lovely start to the day. Love it. So I've gone to somewhere. I'll stop talking.
Okay, so the next question, I think you touched on this, but it was somebody did ask about how you decided which text to read. So
yeah, well, initially we started with this kind of like idealistic view, or I did. My friend that I particularly discussed with bounce ideas off, another English teacher, that I wanted them to be really challenging, that I wanted them to be reading classic texts and texts that they would not read in their normal kind of frame of reference, unless they were an avid reader. Like I did read when I was a teenager, you know, Jane Eyre and things like that. My mum gave them to me. But most pupils, if we look back to that statistic about only something like 30.8% of pupil or kids read, are not going to be doing that. So that was the initial choice. And then I kind of brainstormed and consulted with other people about the kinds of text that we could put in there. But then realistically, also by budget, as I said, we looked in the English cupboard and found texts which we had previously taught but didn't anymore. And so that was the next stage, to then categorise them into year groups. And after the first sort of year, or sort of halfway through it, some of the texts which were particularly challenging, so, well, not really, but there was, for example, we have Around the World in 80 Days, was originally written for children, but the tutor who read that in, I think it was year 8 or year 7 at the time, the tutor struggled with it, and I think that's because she was somebody who was not confident with reading, so we had to go in and do a lot of modelling of that. So over time I didn't want to water it down, but I did find that within the year 7 and 8 I would kind of try to give maybe a group of slightly more challenging texts, maybe with one that was a young teenage fiction text, like The Giver, for example. Still a good book for them to be reading as a reading book, and then kind of like just sort of balance them out across the year. But as we got to Key Stage 4, well, not Key Stage 4, year 9 and 10, we kind of increased the challenge into mainly classic texts, but not always. And the only other thing that I mentioned on that, I did have to start to consider the length of text, because some texts just, if you only can get 2 sessions a week, then longer texts, I think there's too many gaps between it for the kids, and I think that if they're sat reading the same thing all year, it's too much. So they need to be, if you've got more sessions, brilliant, but if you haven't, then the length of text is also a priority.
So basically, Joe, I'm doing that thing that you said at the very beginning of the presentation, that we're all just on our phones. I'm on my phone tweeting. It's terrible, isn't it? It's terrible. So
there's one here from Anna, Jake. How do you support tutors who may be finding it daunting to read aloud? I think you touched upon it, Joe, but...
Yeah, well, we did literacy training throughout the year as part of our whole school CPD. So within that, kind of things like reading strategies and so forth might be covered there. But really, in terms of the actual tutor reading, it was things like providing the PowerPoints, especially as I built that collection up around the more challenging text first, that might, for them and for their pupils, just give them what the genre is, what the key themes are, how it linked, what the kind of context of the book is, because that would help them as part of their understanding. We did advise teachers, to read ahead of their pupils, and you don't have to be far ahead, only a few pages ahead, and just read and prepare. So if they read through the chapter they think they might get through, or the pages they think they might get through before, and they predict the words that are going to be challenging, the bits that the pupils might struggle with, they can, I mean, the head teacher at the time, the acting head, used to come to us before, right, what's this word here? What's this? And ask us. And if they're proactive in that, then that supports them within the classroom, that they're not going to be stumbling with the kids. However, there were some teachers who thought, right, well, if we come across a word and we're not sure, we'll look it up together as a class, and they liked that. They didn't feel not confident to do that. In some ways, it was the joy of, like, it's all right to not know, and let's look for it together. But then the main way we did it for the teachers that really kind of were unsure was that I said that it was the head of English didn't have a form at the time. Myself, a couple of other people went into those forms on a kind of maybe a weekly basis for the first few weeks, and did the reading in the class for them and modelled it for them. And then obviously the guest reader schedule supported that as well, and also meant that the pupils were hearing a range of voices. So often, for example, it might be the case in many schools there might be more female teachers than male, and this school was a girls' school, and there were. So having the deputy head and assistant head, even the data manager volunteered to read and go in and read and hear male voices, but just different voices, was good for the kids as well.
Oh, I think that's what I love about this, I think, Jo. I think it's that everybody had a buy-in with it. Like you said, the data manager, you know, just other people within the school, just everybody.
Yeah. And the school business manager, people who were not teachers were coming in and reading as well. And they just went into the guest reader schedule. So it was really nice for them to see, and people read in different ways. Like some people slower, some people do the voices, you know, like, so I think for the tutors as well to see that we're not all reading in this like amazing kind of like on Broadway kind of way all the time, but we're still reading more fluently and with more kind of prosody than pupils might be doing. So yeah,
I think this, because I found when I've read aloud, there's that power as well to allow the children to see you struggle with the words as well, I think. And that's another thing I love about this programme, and you was reading to them, that they to see, like you said, that we will still struggle with words, and we've got to take that time to work them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of go back to a sentence and start again, or try an accent and get it wrong. And just that, the idea that we get better by doing it, but we're not failing if we don't know every word. Well, I don't know every word. So, you know, it's allowing them to see that, to see how you become a comfortable reader, I suppose.
Cool. Jake, have you got questions?
I'm just gobsmacked by the 30.8% read to daily. That's madness, isn't it?
Yeah.
Madness. I feel guilty if I haven't read to the kids in the morning before I kick them out of the house. To childcare, I might add. I don't need to kick them out. Sometimes I do and lock the door, but I don't really. They go play with the cows in the back field. It's madness. I don't read to it. So if they can do this, you know, every day. I mean, you was giving it twice a week.
We only had twice a week, but some schools do have longer. An accelerated reader, that was another problem. I think they recommend that the pupils had to do half an hour's reading 5 times a week or something, and it's really hard to find that in a school week when the curriculum time is at a premium as well. But some schools have a longer tutor time, and obviously that lends itself, because 15 minutes was a push, and you really, really had to be on it with, like I say, the routines. Like you had the tutors who got the kids trained from the beginning, who had a nominated pupil to get the books out on that day, but even before the teacher got there, and then the teacher being on time, you know, the registered in really, really quickly, and then just reading and then put away was really important. And then just things like the bookmarks that were created were really a good way of getting the books handed out quickly to the right page, of, like I say, keeping place if you do stop to explain a word, but also just leave it at that. Because there was one, when we launched it, one year group, a tutor with some year 7, really, really enthusiastic. When she launched it, she gave them all their cardboard bookmark. They all did amazing decorations on them and put their names on them. And then next time they've spent hours trying to hand out the books to the right pupils, and that really, really wasn't the point. So we had to say to them, really sorry, but you're gonna have to just take whatever book you get.
Love it. Brutal. Yes, here's your book. Read it. Brilliant. So Annabelle made a good point. It's not a question, but we can talk. So Annabelle's had to record herself reading, so the tutors don't have to do. What's your opinion on that? I mean, for me, isn't it lovely? They get read to, but are they really being read to if it's pre-recorded? I mean, there's nothing better than.
There are. I know some people will let them use audiobooks, and I think Fiona lets them use audiobooks if they're really struggling. But to be honest, I didn't do that. Sometimes we let the pupils do that in English, or occasionally. But I just think, maybe I'm a bit mean, but I was really a bit of a stickler for it when I first launched it, and the head of English was right behind me with it, which was brilliant.
Louise, she's nodding. Yeah,
Louise was one of the tutors who did really well, so thank you, Louise. And I don't know if Jo Jukes is there, but she also was one of the tutors who was brilliant and brilliant supportive. But there was, in the sort of initial training with them and the launch of it to tutors, there were a few of these questions, and I kind of was a bit blunt, like I said earlier, that as if we don't do it and we're not used to it, then it's something we need to develop. But essentially, we are all university trained. We can read. You know, we should be able to read, even if we don't read often ourselves. And I think that we've got a duty as teachers. We stand in front of the class every day and talk to them. And I would argue, we should be doing reading across the curriculum in every lesson in some form. And so, like you say, to give that buy-in, if we say stand in front of the class and say, right, I'm not going to read to you because I don't like to, or I'm not very good, but here's a recording, then we're not selling the whole idea that we're trying to, you know, the development of it. And I think that we just have to be a bit firm with tutors and say, look, if you're really worried, we'll model it for a few sessions. Make sure you've read the book before, practice at home. And it's not very many pages in that time sometimes. It's not going to take you very long. It take you 15 minutes at home to read the book, if you've got a 15-minute form time. And I think we have to be kind of strict that we make people do it, because it is a professional responsibility to model and to promote reading. And it goes back to, we're saying, if we're creating a school culture, every teacher has to support that. And as long as the head teacher and the SLT are also supporting that, then teachers who don't do it become the odd ones out. And that might be a bit mean, but it's creating a culture.
And you've got the guest speakers as well. I mean,
yeah, I think that really helped.
Yeah.
Well, and apart from anything, it helped with giving it that kind of kudos and making sure people knew that could happen. And when they weren't being a guest speaker, certain members of SLT were saying, can you go around on a Wednesday, because there's a few forms there that maybe, and they would wander around and make sure it was happening, just not a drop in like an observation, but they could just, you know, make sure that the kids were getting the books out, or just be there to support the tutors, so that, and also to support me in making tutors do it, because if we're being realistic, that is the biggest challenge. Wasn't the kids, it's the teachers sometimes. So, and it is just fear, but you put all these things in place, and there were some teachers who were terrified. One in particular who said a PE teacher had come back from maternity and said, and had an older child, and said, I haven't read to my child at home, and I'm really scared, I just don't read. And she became one of the most strongest advocates of it, because she loved the routine that it gave her class. She loved that calm start, the reading sat there in silence while she's reading, and she really, really kind of promoted it. And then later on, when I was doing things like we're doing literacy training later, having those teachers as advocates to promote it, to maybe talk a little bit in the training, is also something that, and talk about their experience, that helps to support the idea that we should all be doing it.
It's a shared third object as well, isn't it? You know, you've all read that as a form tutor. Yeah. You know, it's that fine, isn't it? Lou, I'm sorry, I cut over you there.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, so because you were saying about the young girl in year 10, and I remember this was one of the things that really struck me when I watched you at York with this talk. This idea of, you know, it breaks your heart that a child saying they've never ever been read to. And I mean, after that, the school I was at, we had the Dear Silent Reading Time, and I normally had my year 9, year 10 crazy boys, period 5, and it was just a nightmare trying to get them. So I started reading to them after watching you. Sort of went against my school's policy, actually, but hey ho. But it actually got them quite engaged, and they really enjoyed it, and they wanted me to read, and they asked. So thinking about that, what sort of feedback did you get from the students after you'd, you know, sort of got this in place?
We would get the usual kind of loud, moany feedback via tutors from some children who, they don't want to read this book, they don't like this book. And I think sometimes the tutor was just genuinely passing on as feedback on a book, but sometimes it was allowing the pupils to kind of to give that. And you've got to sell your enthusiasm yourself, I think, even if you don't love it. And also, I thought it was all right to say, we're not going to love every book. Like, we don't love every film, we don't love every song. But if we've read it, we can then at least say why we didn't like it at the end. And it allows you to understand different genres and different things. But when we did the pupil voice, and sometimes the head of English would do it through the guise of getting English feedback on English, but we would ask about these things. Or when individual teachers talk to the pupils, then lots of kids did give really good feedback that they liked the reading. They liked having somebody else do the reading for them, because it was kind of that shared experience. But mainly for a lot of kids, it was that calm start to the day, which I know it keeps repeating it, but it's for those kids that are quieter, who come to school and walk down a corridor and there's noise, and if they are in a form that's not had routine, where they might have been allowed to sit with the coats and the bags or whatever and chat, that calm start to the day is really good. So overall and over time, I think the positive feedback from pupils did develop, and they didn't love every book, some more than others, but giving them feedback on that as well. We used to get sometimes, can we pick the next book? But well, no, because I haven't got the money to just pick whatever book you all want to read. But you take their feedback and evolve with it as you decide which books, but at the same time, it's not giving in and lowering the standard that you want to have, I think.
Yeah, I think it could, I mean, I think, yeah, for people who are thinking about this, like you're saying, go back in September, when we're going to have a lot of anxious staff, a lot of anxious students, sort of a kind of a different, sort of the new, kind of the same, but slightly different, to be able to have, just that, this calm routine of just that calm, you're coming in and somebody's just reading to you. I mean, there's nothing better than having somebody read to you, is there?
And especially, I think, for year 7 as well, like coming through, and if we're thinking about this current year 7 coming through, we haven't had the same transition, even in normal times, year 7, they come from primary school and they're used to being read to, and they're used to that being something that that is reading for reading's sake. You know, they will read a class reader as a story, as well as the ones they will do guided reading work with and so far. So for them, coming through in this time, sitting there together, having someone read to them, whether it's with the class having a book or just the teacher, it's like Jack and Ori. And there is something, they won't be sat on the carpet, fair enough, but there's something comforting about it. And like you say, you can talk about the characters, you can talk about how they're feeling, so it allows you to talk about those kind of emotions and different experiences that people from different walks of life have. So there's something that kind of brings it together as a community, I think. And I think that, like we say, if we're not allowed to share books and pass them around so much, a cheap way to do it is for the teacher just to read. And if you were going to set something up on the sort of scale I did with lots of books, probably, unless you did it right through the summer, it'd be quite difficult. You'd probably maybe launch it later, whether that was after half term or something. But if you just wanted the teachers to read, that would be quite easy to set up by September. So.
Thank you. Right, let's just see.
There's a couple of questions, but I think you've sort of acknowledged them and addressed them, but please, Joe, butt in if you haven't. So how do you support tutors who may find it daunting to read aloud? My understanding there is, you know, the SLT could go and support and whatever.
Yeah, and we went in and modelled it and actually did it ourselves for a few sessions first, and they watched. And some teachers might have TAs in the classroom with them. The TAs can read too. It doesn't always have to be the teacher.
It's just any adult. It's lovely. Just any adult can go and read to a group of children, because 70% of kids don't get read to it daily. It's bonkers. And
there are some pupils who are really good readers, and people might say, well, can't they read? And they could, but they'll do that in lesson time. But I think if you start doing that, it dilutes the thing, and suddenly you'll end up like with kids reading and tutors being busy doing something else. I think it has to be that leading from the front again all the time.
The buy-in. We're all going to enjoy this story, these characters. We love it. Emma Jones has said, so I think you alluded to this a little bit. Do you stop and explain the meaning of the difficult words when reading to the students?
Yeah, not every single word, because obviously that would just take too long. I think if there's a word you're reading it and you just realise they're really not going to understand it, then just quite quickly just stop and explain it. If you've not prepped and you don't know it, that could be an opportunity to, right, let's get a dictionary out, let's Google and see what this word is, and use it as a kind of teaching thing in that sense. But and if you do prep before and just find them, write the word, the meaning in the margin so you don't forget, you can quickly do it. But I wouldn't stop every word and every word. It might be that you read, to the end of a section or the end of a paragraph, and you quickly stop and just paraphrase it and make sure you understood the paragraph, because otherwise you're going to be there forever. And we're not asking them to teach English. We're not asking them to teach the text. Just that, I think that from like the evidence that I showed about the reading over 12 weeks of fast reading, and then going back and you can do the studying later, just hearing the characters, and the stories have a rhythm and a familiarity that we're used to. So reading fiction is much easier than reading non-fiction. which is why when they come to secondary school, the challenge for many kids is that at primary school or younger, a lot, especially when they read at home, a lot of what they do is fiction. And when they come into secondary school, a lot of what they're reading, the majority of it is non-fiction if they are reading across the curriculum. That's really difficult. It's all unfamiliar language, often tier 3 language. But when you read stories, they follow the structure of stories. They're familiar to them. They understand the names of characters mean things and relationships between them. So if you are just reading and keeping going, the momentum going, and maybe at the end of the session, oh, wasn't that amazing? What happened to so-and-so? Oh, God, do you think that character was really bad? They can get the gist, they can keep going. And I don't think that stopping to explain every word is the aim of this, although we would do that on some and be selective.
If you want to engross yourself with the story and you know, you really get yourself in the story, there's nothing worse than, I mean,
yeah,
when you're watching films with the kids, it's so irritating, isn't it? Like Frozen 2 is the new one, isn't it? Frozen 2. But Daddy, why? I know it was Olaf was doing the Frozen 1 storyline. I was like, why is he doing that? I'm like, I don't know. It's just these, just so you remember, Noah. Just
so we've had a few more questions come through, Joe. So Chris has asked, what do you think about downloading a Kindle app to the interactive whiteboard to potentially save money instead of buying the book?
Yeah, that's something actually, interestingly. I've always been a kind of advocate of having a book, just in life, having a book. And that idea of that phonological loop of seeing and hearing, I think, this might be wrong, but I always think it's a little bit harder to read from a screen that's away from you than to have a book. However, after I did this presentation at Brewed York when we were there, and John Thompson, who's the head teacher of Huntingdon School, was there, and he came to see me afterwards, and he was really liked it, and asked me to go for a meeting with him there about setting it up there. And one of the things he wanted to talk about was that idea that if he was going to read something like Jane Eyre, for example, or Pride and Prejudice, actually, it was Pride and Prejudice he was talking about, it has the cost of it, but you could get it free. Some of these classic books are free online without even a Kindle. So you can, and he was talking about showing it on the screen, he reading it. So it is there for the pupils. They don't have to be reading along with the heads down, but they do have to be looking at the board and facing that. So when you're scanning the room, you can see if there's any, they're just staring out the window, looking under the floor, whatever they're doing. And we were discussing this together about what would be the evidence around it, and this evidence about phonological loops. Would it matter? There is discussion around reading from a screen anyways, whether that is as easy to do. So he was talking about either launching it in that way or running it as a discipline inquiry for himself first to see how that works as opposed to not. So it's interesting. It's definitely worth doing. But it would have to be big, because to see it, wouldn't it? It should be big text. But it's a possibility.
Cool.
Joe, we've got a question from, let me just find it, from Jade. During remote learning, a lot of schools have done recordings of books. Do you think that the choice of book and level of challenge is important in this situation?
Do you mean that they've sent does it mean the books have been put on the remote learning for the kids to listen to, like an audio book?
Yeah, it doesn't clarify. It just says during remote learning, they've done recordings. What that means along with. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I suppose if that was the case, that you were putting it on your online platform, for example, and expecting the pupils to read along or to listen to it. Sorry. I mean, you're still going to think about the choice of book, aren't you? You're going to think about what you want them to read or to hear. Perhaps if they are just doing it at home, you might argue perhaps a significant challenge is going to be too much, because they're going to switch off if there isn't a teacher there to guide them on particular things. Having said that, some if you get audiobooks, if they're read really well by a really engaging reader, sometimes the story just grabs you anyway. Dickens is full of character. If a teacher's recorded that and with all the voices and it's been done really well, that could still engage your pupils. But I think in the short term for remote learning, if you were doing that, it would just be about keeping them reading and keeping them engaged. Perhaps if it was in the longer term, then you might think about that and how it supports the rest of your curriculum as well. But yeah, I think you would always be selective. You're always going to think about the book that's being read, that you're giving to them.
Cool. think Kaylee said that they've actually used the the visualizers, so putting the books under the visualizers for the screen, and that's been effective. I think there's one last one there, Jake, if you want to take this one from Donna. Do you want to take your mute off as well? You're muted.
I'm muted. Look at that. Tell you what, my colleagues would like that button, I'm telling you.
I love how much you make Louise Cass laugh.
I know. So, question, Donna. Okay, yes, this is more when you're in the form tutor. So, are children allowed to sketch or close their eyes whilst listening, or would you prefer them all to be reading along?
Well, when we did it, they weren't. And again, this goes back to the idea of David Didow would say that they can just listen, and some pupils can't process the words by looking at it and hearing at the same time. So if they want to close their eyes, if they want to just kind of like just absorbing the listening, if they want to be doodling that maybe, perhaps he would say that that's fine. We decided that's not what we wanted, because partly we wanted them to have the book and to see the words. But initially, as I said, to begin with, it was almost more of it was two things together. It was that, but it was kind of behaviour management as well. So because we didn't have a culture of reading, or we had kids that had been, where there had been tutor reading, if it wasn't done well, they weren't reading, they were sitting and looking out the window. You know, when you look and someone's got the book upside down, or that idea that they're not actually engaged. We wanted to make it easy so that if the teacher is reading, they can scan around and see the child's got the bookmark and they're on the page, and you can stop them and discuss and get back to it. But over time, we did find that once the routines were established, where there were pupils that were particularly struggling readers, maybe some SEM pupils, the teacher or the TA in the room could use their discretion. You know, if the class is working and not working, but is behaving and listening and engaged, and you know there's a pupil over here who really struggles, but if they're not sat looking at the page, but they're just sort of looking at you, or they're just listening, you can tell they're listening. But if you don't have those routines in place at first, then half the time, you know, this turning around face or whatever, half eyes shut asleep, is not what we wanted. But there is an argument that you know, it's better to let them, especially if they're a weak reader. But I think you've got to balance what you want to get out of it. And initially, the initial thing was setting it up as something and giving it every chance to succeed in terms of routine and procedures, which would support the teachers ultimately to do it. And when it becomes kind of second nature, then it's a bit like scaffolding, really. Then you can sort of take some of those things away. And for those pupils, perhaps that is something that might be beneficial to them, to just listen.
It formalises the whole process, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's important. I think that's it, question-wise.
Thank you, Jo. I mean, I've enjoyed it as much the second time as well. I love.
I did waffle a bit, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, I mean, from a non-specialist point of view, that was brilliant, by the way. I loved it. I've made loads of notes, so I'm happy.
Thank you.
So this has been recorded. Lou, is that right? I didn't press the button again, by the way. I forgot.
It says recording in the top corner.
Brill, it's recording. That's fine. That's good. I always forget that, Jo. You see, so Lou and Dave are always like, Jake, press record before you start, and I forget. Just forget. just a biggie.
The session.
This is it. So, Jo, thank you so much. Loved it, and thank you everyone for coming on and listening to what Jo's got to say. Again, carry the conversation on Twitter or DM Jo with questions.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Don't DM me. I've got no idea. I loved all of that. I mean, that was me. Just read to the kids, I think, is what we should do. So, Jo, thank you, and yeah, have a lovely rest of your
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.